to Boek Meester. We continue to make programs because we believe that these times ask for food for thought, for inspiration, and for different voices. Therefore, we are very happy that writer and human rights activist Elif Shafak will join us tonight for a conversation about her essay, How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. You can join us as well by asking questions through the chat function. At the end of the program, those questions will be selected that I didn't dare to ask to Elif Shafak. Two of the most intriguing walk-on characters in this book are a little Egyptian girl named Facebook by her parents, that brief, optimistic face of the Arab Spring, and another baby given the name Like in Israel just a few months later. They are poignant reminders of another age in which social media looks set to deliver a new and better world, but now are we here in polarized societies hit by a pandemic. How do we stay sane? How do we remain optimistic? Elif Shafak has written a sharp and elegant pamphlet. To ask for a quick solution to the rolling calamity is to ask for the moon on a stick, wrote a critic, but there's comfort in having a voice like Shafak's to guide us. In her new book, she delves into the power of stories to bring us together and reveals how listening can nurture our faith in a wiser and kinder future. Welcome, Elif Shafak.
Thank you so much.
Hello. You're in London. We're in Rotterdam. I think a lot of the audience is in Rotterdam as well. Have you ever been physically in Rotterdam, the most Turkish city of the Netherlands? 8% of the population is of Turkish descent.
It is indeed, yes. And I have been in the past, but I wish I could have been there physically. We could have had this conversation under the same roof. But I'm very, very thankful that we can, despite everything that's happening in the world, we can still connect beyond borders.
Thank you for being here. The UK is in the third lockdown already with stricter rules. How would you describe the situation now in London?
Oh, it's very, very mixed. I mean, the numbers have been going up. The NHS is overwhelmed at the moment, so it's quite worrisome. There's also fatigue in many people. I can observe that. I think this is the right time when we need to talk about uncertainty, anxiety, frustration. So many of us across the world, we're going through an emotional turbulence as well as maybe an intellectual one. So perhaps we have arrived at a crossroads when we have to rethink about the world we're living in. And I can see that both in myself and when I look around me.
We'll talk later about anxiety, about anger maybe as well. How are these times for you as a writer? Do you work more, or is the situation too distracting to work on a novel?
I think it's very challenging. I remember at the very, very beginning of the pandemic, actually, a publisher, with all the good intentions, no doubt, they had shared a message on social media saying, for writers, this is not going to be a big challenge. Because after all, writers are lonely creatures or solitary creatures. They are used to working on their own at home, so it's not much of a difference for them. But actually, I think it's the opposite. Like everyone else, it has affected us. Personally, I found myself questioning, what am I doing in this moment in time? Does it really make a difference whether you find the perfect synonym, whether you change a comma, whether you reconstruct that sentence? When people are dying, when there's so much injustice, when there's so much inequality, when there's an urgency to this moment we're living, then you question yourself, is this the book that I should be writing right now? So in a way, this little pamphlet or manifesto, this booklet was born out of that necessity, in a way, to understand myself, to respond to this moment. There's a very powerful quote by Doris Lessing in one of her essays when she says, literature is analysis after the event. You need some time to pass. You need to process. And in that sense, maybe all writing is in retrospect. I understand that and I respect that. But there are moments in time when literature becomes analysis during the event, while things are happening. So I think this is one of those moments in time.
Did you hesitate to write about the pandemic?
Yes and no, because everything is changing so fast. It is a risk to write about the pandemic while things are happening, precisely because of this during or after difference. You need some time to process, to understand. But at the same time, I felt an urgency, and especially these emotions that we will be talking about. I think they're very urgent. They're very much in this moment, and we're all struggling with them. Some of us maybe seem to be coping better, some of us less so, but I think it's very universal. This is a moment of change. It is a moment in which the old world is no more. It's gone, but the new world is not born yet. And we are in this moment of in-betweenness, and that is very scary. It is exhausting. It is full of uncertainties, but I think that's where we are right now. It's also full of possibilities, I should add.
Your Dutch publisher chose the title, translated in Dutch, is Hoe houd je moed in een tijd van verdeeldheid? And they chose the word courageous instead of sane. Could you tell us why you chose the word sanity, where it stands for you?
Yes, actually, this was something that had been on my mind for a while, but I couldn't express it in this way until the pandemic kicked in. I believe this is the right moment we should be talking about mental health, and what does it mean to be, we have to redefine what is happiness, what is to be a happy individual, content individual. What are our priorities as individuals, but also as societies? And I think mental health or sanity is a big part of that conversation, and we should be able to talk about these issues in the public space, which are not easy subjects, and I think they're a little bit more challenging for women, or for, especially for minorities, I think even more so. But this is the right moment. We need to talk about this, to be able to talk about this, because I think it is affecting our mental health, as well as the health of our societies, as well as our physical health. So mental health is a big part of this conversation.
Is that the first thing you think about when you think about the pandemic, about mental health or inequality, as you say, that minorities have less voice?
When I think about the pandemic, I think about many things at the same time, because I think it's very multi-layered. But what I do believe is that the pandemic did not create the inequalities. Those inequalities were already there. The fractures in our systems were already there. But in a way, the pandemic made it more clear. It exposed. At the beginning of this virus, there were these claims that this was going to be a great equalizer. That's what people were calling it in the UK, meaning we're all in this together, East and West, poor and rich, black and brown and white, whatever your background, we're all in this together, and the virus affects all of us. So that was the claim. But in reality, it turned out it was not the great equalizer. In reality, it turned out that people from disempowered, disadvantaged backgrounds were much more susceptible, were much more vulnerable. And every statistics shows us, for instance, here in London, if you live in a relatively poorer neighborhood or borough, your chances of contracting the virus and dying from the virus are almost 3 times as high as someone who's living in a wealthier neighborhood. So even in a city, you see those inequalities playing out. And we have seen both in America, in Europe, across the world, that minorities have been affected much worse from the pandemic, not only health-wise, but also economically. We also know that with the economic recession, women will be losing their jobs, more women. We know that more immigrants will be losing their jobs, but also young people. We need to talk about what does it mean to be young at this moment. I think the younger generations are having one of the hardest challenges, and many of them are also afraid, worried about their economic futures. So this is a big, big paradox, because until now we were thinking, at least my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, they were thinking, these are hard times, but tomorrow is going to be better. You know, if I invest in my children's education, that education is going to give them better job opportunities. I think what's different right now is that faith in tomorrow is very much bruised, and that's an important thing.
You refer in your book to a conclusion of Dahlia research that over half of citizens living in democracies think their voices never or rarely matter in politics. How is it that with all these digital and media platforms, so many people feel voiceless?
Indeed, and I think that's one of the biggest paradoxes of our times, and it's something that really we find exhausting, frustrating. Because let's go back in time, early 2000s, there was a moment of optimism, and back then, one of the biggest optimists were tech optimists, right? And they were telling us that if we have enough technology, if we have Facebook everywhere, if we have Twitter everywhere, democracy was going to come along. But also, in a way, they were saying that thanks to digital technologies, that progress would be inevitable. Liberal democracy would be inevitable. And everyone was going to have an equal voice. That was the promise in early 2000s of tech optimism. Now, fast forward where we are right now, it's not that everyone has an equal voice. Actually, something else happened. Amidst this cacophony of noises, we feel like our voices are being unheard. And that is very frustrating, because potentially it seems like we have the platforms to express ourselves, and yet amidst the noise, we still feel as citizens, as individuals, silenced, disempowered. I think that feeling runs across the world. Imagine if that higher percentage of citizens in Western democracies say that their voices are unheard. Imagine the percentage of people feeling the same way in undemocratic societies, in societies where there's a dictatorship or autocracy, much, much higher. So we have across the world a huge number of people who are saying openly, I feel that my voice is being unheard. And I think this has repercussions, political, social, cultural repercussions that we all need to think about and worry about.
You lend voice to the voiceless in your novels. I want to ask how you do that. For instance, for your novel 10 minutes, 38 minutes in a strange world, did you speak to the prostitutes in Istanbul, and what did you want to know from them?
I lived in Istanbul for many years. I used to live on a street called Kazancı, which is actually very briefly mentioned towards the end of the book. The literal translation would be the street of cauldron makers. This is a street that runs from, it's a very steep street that runs down from Taksim Square. I lived there for many years when I was much younger, and it was a street full of minorities. It was a street full of history. Even the history of that street says so much about the complexity of Istanbul. Very briefly, I can share with you that this particular street was mostly populated by Christian minorities, Jewish minorities in 1940s earlier. But many of them left because they felt unwelcome, they felt unwanted. So they left the streets. In 1970s, sexual minorities moved in to the same streets. And after 1980, many of them were driven out, sometimes by force. So many of them felt unwelcome. And then in 1990s, writers moved in, feminists moved in, and then over time, many of them left. But while I was living there, I had the impression that it wasn't a street, it was like a street boat. We were all passengers. People came, people went. From every cluster of people, something remained, like remnants of the past. And I thought it's a writer's job to look for those remnants of memory. So this is what I do all throughout my writing. I listen a lot to people. I talk to people a lot, of course, especially with minorities. But there's also maybe psychological dimension behind, because of my own upbringing. You know, there are times when I felt a bit like an insider outsider myself. So that's also a big part of this. But
And
throughout,
why was that? Why did you feel an insider as well as an outsider?
I think there were many, many layers to that. But very briefly, one thing I can share is I was born in Strasbourg in France. And afterwards, my parents separated. My father stayed in France. My mother brought me to Turkey. For her, it was motherland. For me, it was a new country. So from Strasbourg, from this very liberal environment full of leftist students, we came to Ankara, to a very conservative neighborhood, to a very patriarchal neighborhood, where in a way we were the odd ones out because my mom was a young divorcee, which I briefly mentioned in the book. And I was raised from that moment onwards by a traditional grandmother. I've always felt like I didn't quite belong. That feeling has never left me. So maybe enough of an insider to understand, to love the culture, but maybe enough of an outsider to have a little bit of cognitive distance. That feeling never left me. But basically, I think, much more importantly than all of this, what I believe is literature is about making the invisible more visible, is about giving more voice to the silenced, is about bringing the periphery to the center, is about changing power relations. So at the heart of literature, at the heart of the art of storytelling, I think there is resistance always. And that part for me is very important.
I want to talk a bit more about listening to other people. What if you how do you maintain a dialogue with someone that is fundamentally opposed to you?
Yeah, which is very difficult for all of us. I think honestly, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we're having at the moment, and we're going to have this for many more, maybe decades. Why? Because we're living in an extremely polarized world, and their emotions are running very high at the moment. So one thing that I do bear in mind, however, is that I'm primarily a storyteller. And when you are a writer, you have to learn both intellectually, but almost spiritually. You have to learn to put yourself in the shoes of another person and try to look at truth or the world through their eyes. I am very critical of so many things. For instance, Brexit, for instance, populism, for instance, nationalism. But that doesn't give me the right to say everyone who voted for Brexit is wrong. I don't know.
What do you want to learn from these people who voted for Brexit? What do you want to understand?
I think we all have things to learn from each other. That doesn't mean you don't have principles. That doesn't mean clarity. You don't have clarity. You can be very clear and also at the same time ready to listen to people who think differently. Where I draw the line is hate speech. I think hate speech that incites violence is something else altogether. And I don't have any tolerance for that, especially hate speech that incites violence against minorities, against people who are already in a vulnerable situation. That's something else. But other than that, we should be capable of engaging in conversations with people who do not necessarily agree with us. And I honestly think we learn from differences in life. We don't learn much from sameness and repetition.
And do newspapers or journalists have a role in that as well? Because you see the polarization is getting worse by also the media attention sometimes and how they bring their stories.
I think I have mixed feelings in this regard, because on the one hand, I understand very well that journalism is under attack like it has never been before. So I have a lot of respect for journalists who properly want to do their job in a world in which, even in the UK, I have seen tabloids calling judges or critical-minded MPs, calling them enemies of the people. So that kind of populist, aggressive, jingoistic, ultranationalistic language has seeped everywhere, and the media is getting a lot of pressure or unfair attack. This last week, when a few days ago, when these awful incidents happened in the US and they stormed the Capitol Hill, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the slogans that those people had carved on the doors or written on the doors was "Murder the media." So we're living in a world in which it is not easy to defend media freedoms, media diversity. And the part of me understands that and respects that very much. On the other hand, I think the media needs to understand that we need more nuanced conversations. And that is all of us. It's our responsibility together. That is why I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We have too much information. And the truth is we do not process this much information. What we need is to lessen the amount of information that we deal with every day, but increase the amount of knowledge. And that means we need books, we need nuanced conversations, we need investigative journalism, we need in-depth analysis. So not just 2 seconds consumption of information, but deeper. And that means we need to slow down.
What are books that inspire you in difficult times?
Books have always inspired me. Ever since I was a child, I have been a reader of both fiction, maybe I should say East and West, and as years went by, I became a reader of both fiction and nonfiction. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is because sometimes I hear people saying, it's usually male readers who say this, they say, I don't have time for fiction, I read politics, I read history, I read philosophy, so much is happening in the world, I'm trying to understand and keep up with what's happening. And it makes me sad when I hear that, because why are we compartmentalizing knowledge into such artificial groups or categories? I think we should read across the board. We should read both fiction and nonfiction. And to me, it's much more important if a novelist becomes interested in neuroscience, or a neuroscientist becomes interested in cinema, or maybe a filmmaker becomes interested in philosophy, and the philosopher falls in love with poetry. If we dare to leave our zone of comfort and read books that challenge us intellectually, that is when we learn more. So there has to be a diversity in our reading lists.
I read somewhere that when you read a lot of books, fiction, non-fiction, as you say, but when you start working on a novel, you switch to poetry. Why is that?
It's for the language, for the rhythm. I love languages, I should say, plural. I write both in Turkish and English, but mostly English over the years. So I commute between languages, and I feel connected to each language in a very different way. And to be honest, this was a little bit hard to explain in Turkey, because sometimes people have these 19th century nationalistic categories. In a way, they are like saying, if you don't write in English, if you don't write in your mother tongue, then you can't be called a Turkish writer anymore. That's not my perception. I think we're living in a world in which we can dream in more than one language. The mind doesn't know such boundaries. We can commute between languages. And if it's in our hearts, if we feel it emotionally, then why not write fiction in more than one language? So all I'm trying to say is, I think I feel attached to the English language in a more cerebral way. My attachment to the Turkish language is more emotional. If my writing has sorrow, melancholy, longing, I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But if my writing has humor, irony, and satire, then I find it much easier to express these things in English. And I think humor and sorrow, they're both very important in my work.
And love and sex, which languages do you use then?
Yeah, it's a good question, because, I've observed this. Sometimes people find it easier to express their anger in a second language. Just to give you an example, I know many Turkish ladies, like middle-class ladies, for instance, who have been brought up in a certain way, who can never, ever swear in Turkish, but they swear in English so easily, left and right, because you don't have the same, feeling of guilt, perhaps. The psychological impact of words are very different. So I think people switch between languages. And that doesn't mean that you have to be fluent. It's another zone of existence. But it comes back to something else that I want to emphasize. We're living in a world in which we're constantly being put into tribes, into categories, nationalistic, tribalistic categories. And I think it is important to fight for multiplicity, pluralism, and multiple belongings.
What would you say to people? I totally agree and understand what you say, but to come to a question, what would you like to say to people who have a desire to rootedness or a solid identity or a sense for a nation or a certain place? Because those people are there as well.
Indeed, they are there. And actually, those feelings are also inside us. So it's not like some people have a need for rootedness and we don't have it. There are some scholars who have come up with theories like some people are local, some others are globalist. I find those dualities so problematic because inside every one of us, actually, there's a degree of longing for roots. There's also a degree of curiosity for opening up adventures. So as human beings, we're already very complex. And when I look at myself, I realize, of course, I'm an Istanbulite. I think it's very visible in my writing that Istanbul is there, not as a passive scenery, but almost as an active character, as a she city. And that's because I love the city. I carry it with me. But I think equally I feel attached to the Balkans. So put me next to a Greek author, a Bulgarian author, Romanian, Bosnian author. I have so much in common. But that said, there are elements in my soul from the Middle East. So a Lebanese author, Jordanian, Syrian, Iranian, Iraqi author, again, I have so much in common with them. I'm European by birth and the values that I share. And over the years, I became a Londoner, I became a British citizen. And despite what politicians in this country have been telling us, because of this Brexit saga, they've been telling us, if you're a citizen of the world, then it means you're a citizen of nowhere. And I reject that. I think you can be from here and at the same time from planet Earth at the same time. You can be local and regional and global, like concentric circles. So rather than narrowing down, why opening up? But what I'm trying to say is, it's not only people who travel for some reason or another who have multiple identities or multiple belongings, I should say. It's each and every one of us. Maybe you grew up in the same town. You know, you grew up, you were born there, you got married there, you had your own children and family there. So there seems to be a continuity. But maybe because of your political views, sexual identity, racial heritage, maybe because of the stories of your ancestors, maybe because of the football team or the cultural affiliations that you have, etc. Again, you have lots and lots of layers. So all I'm trying to say is each and every human being contains multitudes. But we're living in a world in which it's difficult to defend this. And this is why I think we need to defend it louder.
Just about Istanbul, you say you call it a she city, but if you read about Istanbul, it's patriarchal, it's maybe homophobic, it's sexist, and why is it a feminine city?
Indeed, and I think it's very visible that it's quite patriarchal. I think it's very visible that it's quite homophobic and also transphobic, we should say. So when you walk on the streets, public squares belong to men, streets belong to men, especially after dark, after evening hours. But precisely because of this, I want to remind myself and my readers that the essence of the city is feminine. And there was a long literary tradition that went all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, but also to the Byzantine Empire, in which artists have associated the city with a woman or a goddess, right? So when you read Byzantine writing, Istanbul is associated with goddesses. Or when you read Ottoman poets, Istanbul is regarded as a woman who is very resilient, actually. Despite everything, she renews herself, recreates herself. And I want to revive that tradition of, associating or finding the city's female core. And also for me as a feminist, it's very important that we remind ourselves that this city also belongs to us. Urban spaces also belong to women. It's not men's property. They also belong to minorities. We need to have an equal voice and equal visibility. So from many perspectives, I see Istanbul as a she city. And personally, my experience, the way I remember the city, when I sit down and write, it's always, I think, in a more feminine form. So I want to emphasize that for me, this is a she city.
You live in London. Do you call it your home, or is it your exile?
It's a tough question because it's both. You know, it can be exile and home, and I find it a difficult subject to talk about exile because it's an emotional subject, but it's a painful subject too. Obviously, I feel attached to Istanbul. At the same time, I don't go back to Istanbul. I feel attached to the people, but I'm very critical of its politics and politicians. So, you know, it's a bittersweet feeling. How do you say motherland? What kind of a taste it leaves on your tongue? I mentioned it in one of my TED talks. So these are questions, words that I really think about, read about a lot. And I think many poets, many writers coming from wounded democracies know what I'm talking about. So now we have a long list of countries, whether you're from Brazil or the Philippines or Turkey, you know, that list, Hungary or Poland, even within Europe, we have seen countries going backwards, democracies crumbling. And now we know that democracy is a much more delicate ecosystem of checks and balances. So I think the feeling that I'm talking about of being, you know, this bittersweet taste of the word motherland, I think it would resonate with poets and writers from various countries.
Populist parties are more popular than ever. You have the AFD in Germany, Vox in Spain, Swedish Democrats are mainstream politics now. Are you worried about this development, and how fragile are democracies in Europe?
Yeah, of course, I am worried, and I think we should be worried, because to be worried will make us also more aware of what's happening, in a way more alert, because we have seen that democracy can go backwards. It's not like history always moves forward in a linear progress. Sometimes countries slide backwards. And when that happens, I think women need to be much more concerned, because the first things that will be curbed will be taken away when democracy disappears. The first rights that will be taken away will be women's rights, and it will be minority rights. So we've seen examples of that. You mentioned Vox movement. This is a movement that talks about the good old days of Franco, for instance. And it's not a coincidence that they're hiring buses with pictures of Hitler on those buses, and underneath it says #feminazi. So the argument of Vox movement and populist movements like Vox is that feminists have gone too far, they are destroying traditional family values, you know, we need to restore this masculinity and femininity that we have lost because of these modern times. So what I'm trying to say is, whether it's Salvini in Italy, whether it's the Vox movement, whether it's the populism in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland, we have seen this. There's an anti-women's rights nature in these populist movements, anti-LGBTQ, anti-intellectual, and these are all, and anti-pluralistic. So these are all common traits. Of course, each and every country is different, but there are some common symptoms that we need to understand. But if I may also add this, when we talk about populism, I think we need to understand that populism is the false answer to some very real problems. The problems are real. It's the answer that they are claiming to give that is false. So in other words, populism is not going to solve, but it would be a mistake to think that, okay, let's get rid of populist movements and that will be the end of our problems. We have massive problems of inequality, injustices, fractures in our societies. So unless we deal with these problems, we're going to see more populist movements across the world.
And could we say that that nationalism is the answer for populists as a solution for global problems, but that we should have to work together to solve these problems?
Indeed, and one of the biggest ironies is we are seeing a rise in nationalism at a time when the world has international global challenges like never ever before. So we're right now going through a pandemic, which has shown us that a virus that originates in one part of the world, let's say in Wuhan, China, changes the lives and livelihoods of people living in Canada. It shows that we are interconnected. There are moments when you need international responses to challenges. So whether it's the possibility of another pandemic, whether it's cyber terrorism, whether it's a financial crisis, and very, very importantly, ecological urgency. We're speaking at a moment when our planet is burning. We have an environmental crisis in our hands. So how are we going to solve all these massively global challenges with the forces of tribalism and nationalism? How is that going to be possible? So the irony is not only that nationalism is on the rise, but it's on the rise at such a critical moment in time when we need international solidarity like never before.
And do you have an antidote to this movement, to this rise of populists?
I think we need antidotes. We need a healthy combination of both, maybe pessimism and optimism. And the reason why I say this is because I think too much optimism makes us a little bit complacent. And we have seen a bit of that in early 2000s. People were thinking, okay, history is moving forward anyhow. The Soviet Union is no more. The Berlin Wall has come down. Clearly, it's the triumph of liberal democracy. So from now on, it's the end of history. There was that interpretation early on. But that kind of optimism is misleading. So we need a little bit of pessimism so that we can understand what is at stake and so that we can be more involved, more engaged as citizens. Hannah Arendt, very, I think, poignantly, she used to talk about the need for engagement. And I think it's very important that when you read the writings of survivors of Holocaust or massively darkest chapters in human history, they're all talking about the dangers of numbness. Mm-hmm. They're all talking about the dangers of indifference. So a dose of pessimism is needed in order to overcome indifference. But at the same time, too much pessimism pulls us down. And it turns us into machines of anger. We become too angry, and that's not helpful either. Or it leads us towards apathy in a strange way. We make a full circle. So some dose of pessimism, but also some dose of optimism. And that optimism, I think, is going to come from our fellow human beings. When we meet, when we talk, when I learn the stories of resilience of LGBTQ activists in Brazil, that's going to give me a new perspective, because when I'm going to realize the things that I've been complaining about, maybe there are very little, and these people are resisting. When I learn stories of, minorities in a completely different part of the world, I am going to grow with those stories. So all I'm trying to say is we have to be connected at this moment in time as human beings.
About anger, you mentioned, while working on this book, George Floyd was murdered. There were many protests. The Black Lives Matter movement grew rapidly. How do you regard this anger?
Yeah, and I think that anger is very understandable. And in a way, it shows that you care. So maybe if we don't find ourselves overwhelmed with anxiety or anger or frustration from time to time, maybe we're not following what's happening in the world, right? When we follow, when something as horrific as George Floyd's murder happens, of course, as citizens of the world, we will feel angry. That is very understandable. I'm not in any way erasing the legitimacy of that anger. But all I'm saying is, if we stay in anger, if we remain in anger, in the long run, it becomes repetitive, it becomes tribalistic, and it can become toxic. So we need to take our anger and try to turn it into something more positive, more constructive, and something better, not only for ourselves, but also for our communities and societies. And the people who have been doing this are people like, many people, but especially people like Toni Morrison, for instance. In her writings, she talks about the African-American novelist, thinker, public intellectual Toni Morrison. She talks about how she feels angry and then she sits down and she works. With that anger, she writes. Maybe with that anger, someone else is going to make music. Maybe with that anger, someone else is going to organize, a peaceful movement within their communities. But all I'm trying to say is what we do with that anger is a very important question.
You write anger is the emotion with the longest memory. What do you mean with that?
Because we remember the moments when we felt like our dignity was taken away from us. I think many people, that's a very important word, dignity. They want to be treated equally, you know, and people are aware that they're not invited to the table when decisions are being taken. So that loss of dignity is very important. Also, I talk to people of all backgrounds. I listen to people of all backgrounds a lot. And one of the things that strikes me is how younger people can have the memories of their grandparents. That's always very interesting to me. In families that have some kind of family story or family trauma, it is the youngest people who carry the memories of their grandparents. So in that regard, to anger or hurt or sorrow can have a very, very long memory.
You describe apathy as well, and you call it perhaps even more dangerous than plain evil. Why is the end of all emotions apathy?
I think there's one emotion that is the most dangerous, and that is the lack of all emotions. And by that, I mean apathy. In other words, if I stop caring, if we stop caring together, and there are moments when we come very close to apathy, because imagine, in the newspapers, we read about 500 refugees losing their lives, and then we read about 5,000. Do we really register the difference between 500 and 5,000? If they remain as numbers, do we really feel what that means, that increase in numbers? I don't think so, because there comes a moment when statistics, too much information, without emotional engagement, too much information leads to fatigue, information fatigue. And information fatigue leads to numbness. So that's a very dangerous threshold, because if I stop caring about someone else's story, someone else's sorrow, if I stop caring about what's happening in another part of the world or in my neighborhood right now, and if I start erecting walls of numbness around me, and if everyone does that, that kind of society is a society in which authoritarian regimes can flourish very fast. And we know this because throughout history, anyone who has gone through such dark chapters always warns us against the dangers of citizens becoming disconnected, citizens stopping, to care about each other. That's a very dangerous threshold. There are evil people, but their numbers are smaller. That doesn't explain why widespread atrocities can happen. What explains those atrocities is numbness. If you put numbness into the formula, then if you can make sure that people stop caring, or they start saying, well, I don't know, maybe that's fake news. I don't really, you start doubting everything as citizens. That's a very, very dangerous ground for authoritarianism to flourish.
I really love your energy, but do you never feel fatigue yourself?
I do. Of course, I'm, like all of us, I have so many contradictions. I have so much anxiety. And that's why I'm writing about these negative emotions, because I see them in myself and I see them around me. But I also know that when we write, when we put things into words, and when we listen, then our energy changes. So I'm not saying that I don't have anxieties, angers, fears, and frustrations, just the opposite, because I have them in abundance. I also keep asking myself, what do I do with this, or with all these ingredients, And that question resonates with me. I think this is a time when we need books. This is a time when we need stories, because stories help us to build emotional connections. Emotions are so important. My background is in political science. And I think it's very problematic that within political science, I haven't read too many studies. There aren't too many studies that focus on the role of emotions. Why? Because it's not, quantitative data. You can't really measure emotions. But it's a pity, because we're living in a world in which emotions guide and misguide politics. And in turn, they're also guided and misguided by politics. So all I'm trying to say is, I think it's a pity that populist demagogues are much more aware of the power of emotions than their liberal counterparts. We need to talk about emotions. I think they matter a lot.
You say stories can help us, but many people have difficulties reading or to concentrate. These are often the ones that appeal to populists. How to reach them?
Yeah, and also populists create this illusion that actually you don't need books, you don't need intellectual debates. The word intellectual itself has become a very negative concept, hasn't it? And sometimes, especially in Turkey, I hear populists saying our true, people are, they are pure, they're honest. People who haven't been educated, they are pure. So this glorification of a romanticized vogue is something we have seen throughout history. And a big part of that is an anti-intellectual, anti-knowledge movement. In other words, populists in such countries are saying, well, those, writers, academics, poets, they're too westernized. They're not part of our culture anyhow. They have been too corrupt. They have been, too diluted with Western culture. I want to question all these dualities. I think books matter a lot, and books teach us a lot. We learn a lot from books. So it is important that we spread the love of reading, that we share nuanced intellectual conversations, and also encourage them. Because unfortunately, these binary oppositions are so dominant in our lives. People want to know, are you here or are you there? Where is your tribe? I think a proper intellectual exchange means I have my opinions. I thought about them. I have my principles. I'm here to defend them, but I'm also here to listen to you. And if what you say to me makes sense, I'm ready to change my views. So this is very important. We forgot to say this, just to leave the door open a little bit in a proper conversation, to listen to the other side and be willing to revise our own truths if what the other is saying makes sense to us. To be open that way, I think is something that we have lost to a great extent.
How to find it back? Is it education? Is it should children learn it on school?
I think a big part of it is empathy, because if I know your story, it will be easier or relatively more possible for me to understand where you're coming from. If you know my story, it will be easier for you to understand where I'm coming from. So this is not only an intellectual thing that I'm talking about, it's also emotional. It's also about stories. Earlier I mentioned about 500 refugees, 5,000 refugees. If I know the stories of every single refugee or every single person who is going through enormous challenges right now, then my perception of them will be different. And maybe I will find it difficult to make a distinction between us and them, because I will realize what I call the other is also my brother. What I call the other is my sister. What I call the other is also me. So in order for me to make that connection, I need empathy. And for empathy, we need to know people's stories. So I think we do need the art of storytelling at this very critical moment in time.
At the end of the book, you write also about ancient wisdom, and that we should listen to shamans, but also old women of Anatolia. What do they have to tell us?
I think in my novels, maybe it's quite visible that I respect oral culture, and there's a part of me that's very interested in that women's culture that sometimes people look down upon because they regard it as a domain of not knowledge or science or rational thinking. I've never approached it that way. I like to bridge as much as I can written culture with oral culture. And maybe it's because I was raised, as I mentioned, by two women. My mom was very westernized, very rational, logical, urban, modern. And my grandmother was pretty much the opposite in every respect. And I've seen the solidarity between these two women. But I've also learned from my grandmother that there are different ways of attaining knowledge. My grandmother was not a very well-educated woman. She hadn't properly graduated from a high school because she was not allowed. As a girl, her education had been denied. And yet she was one of the wisest people I have ever met in my life. So she taught me that in order to be wise, you don't need a diploma. And that made me respect that there are different forms of knowledge. I like wisdom, and I think we need to think about these concepts more closely at this moment in time.
I want to give the audience the chance to put some questions to you. I can't read the chat function, but Christian, one of the editors here present in Arminius, can read them. Have you already found a question?
Yes, indeed. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I will give some people a turn. So if you hear your name, please turn on your microphone. The first question is from Saimira, who has a question about how to adjust to new mentalities.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for this inspiring evening. It's a pleasure to listen to you. My question is about our identities. As someone who has lived in so many countries, how have you dealt with gaining a new identity while not losing your old one? Because I notice a lot of people, especially migrants, people who come from another culture, they struggle with this because they think, if I adjust to a new culture, then I'm somebody else and I automatically lose who I was. That is, I'm not the same person anymore. And they see that as a problem. There is a struggle. Have you had this problem? I mean, how do you deal with it?
I thank you so much. I think it's such an important question. And it's a question that resonates with me because I have had this question, throughout my life. I felt it as I moved from one culture to another. But I have learned over time that it is actually a strength to have multiple belongings. And unfortunately, we are living in a world in which we are taught the opposite. So extremists on all sides, extremists both in Europe and in the Middle East and elsewhere, they're telling us, what are you? Are you, for instance, Muslim? Are you this? Are you that? Are you Dutch? Are you, choose your category and stay in that category, as if you cannot be many things at the same time. But I think we are many things at the same time. And why are we trying to reduce that down? It is an extremist narrative that rises from that kind of narrowing down, in fact. So, and it makes people unhappy. So this is why I find it important to defend multiple belongings. I will always be, Istanbulite, but at the same time, I'll be a Londoner. At the same time, I'm a European. At the same time, I am a world citizen, a citizen of humanity. So why don't we teach ourselves and our children that actually they have multiple belongings? That's why I like that poem by Walt Whitman, in which he mentions that every human being has multitudes inside. And I think especially throughout 1960s and 70s, when I look at African-American women's movement, they were very much aware of that. When I read their writings, that inspires me a lot, because many of them were women of color. They knew how racism worked, because many of them were women. They knew how patriarchy or sexism worked. Many of them were sexual minorities. They knew how homophobia worked or transphobia worked. And many of them came from disadvantaged backgrounds. They were not born rich, so they knew how class hierarchy worked. And when you read their work, someone like Audre Lorde, for instance, she says, look at me. I'm a woman, I'm a poet, I'm Black, I am this, I'm that, and I'm many more things that you might not be able to see at first glance. So we forgot to say that in today's progressive movements. We forgot to say, I contain multitudes. If we can do that, I think it will also be much better for especially people who come from mixed cultural backgrounds.
Why are politicians so afraid about promoting pluralism?
There's an unfortunate moment in the sense that as nationalism and tribalism increases, mainstream politicians, especially in Europe, I noticed they started to feel the need to use a much more nationalistic rhetoric in order to make sure that they don't lose their base. So in a way, populist nationalism and populist jingoism is changing the language of politics across the board. and it's having an impact beyond its power. That is very dangerous. And it's also changing the language of politics in the sense that politics becomes almost like a warfare. Someone who has different opinions from me is not my enemy, but suddenly we started to think of opponents as enemies. You know, these martial metaphors. Even in the UK, I see this a lot. All these metaphors of warfare and struggle. That's not politics. So we need to be careful. I think words matter. It always starts with words, the loss of democracy, the loss of diversity. And I think they always go hand in hand. It is not a coincidence that, look at every country where democracy is lost. In those countries, there's zero appreciation for diversity. Just the opposite, countries that have mature democracies are also countries in which there is more diversity, inclusion, you know? So diversity is a big, big part of this conversation. But because of this rise of nationalism and tribalism, I think many mainstream politicians have dropped that idea. The word multiculturalism 10 years ago, it was a positive word. Today, nobody uses it anymore. So I keep a list of all those words that have fallen from grace. And unfortunately, diversity and multiculturalism are on that list. And I think we should defend diversity. We should defend pluralism. They matter.
Thank you. Another question, maybe?
Yes, there's a question from Kees Bakhuizen about intuition of writing. Kees, could you please unmute your microphone? Looks like Kees is gone from the chat. But I can read the question.
Yes.
And the question was a similar question from Rick, who has also left the chat. And his question is, when you write, what kind of process do you go through? What part is intuition? What part is analyzing and correcting your text? And how do you come to the conclusion that the text is good enough or maybe even perfect?
It's a great question. And I think you always doubt as a writer. Sometimes you feel like like the story is flying, and the next day you feel like, you know, it's going all the way down. So we go through moments of anxiety a lot, I think, as authors. But what I do is, I think there are two different ways of writing a novel, particularly for novelists. One is a bit like engineering, one method, in which the writer wants to be in charge of everything and wants to know how the story is going to end. It's a bit like, you know, you want to know the structure, the plot, and the writer has to be in control. I respect that, but that's not my method. That's not my way. My way is the second way. I like to write with intuition. I like to follow almost like an animal instinct. Sometimes you write, you follow the flow of language. You follow a character, and you don't know what that character is going to do in the next chapter. I like it when my characters surprise me. I like it when the endings of my books surprise me. You know, so I don't plan everything ahead. I don't try to be in charge of the book. But what I do is, whatever I write about, I do a lot of research on that subject. But insane amount of research. I listen, I take notes, I fill notebooks, every single detail. And then after months of preparation, I close everything, I stop reading, and then I can fly. But for me to be able to take off and fly, I need to know what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of research behind every book. But you don't know when you start a novel how it ends? No, usually I don't. I mean, very, very rare. And I've also had cases in which you know, a side character, a character that I was planning to keep on the side became much more dominant. And I was surprised by the development of that character myself. I think that's a good thing, you know. So I like to keep intuition at the head of the writing process. About writing, from Instagram, we know that you like eating sunflower seeds and olives when you work. Do you have any other routines? Yes, I mean, I actually, for the Spectator magazine, this last month, I wrote a piece about this. I like to listen to music. I can never write in silence. And I find it very, very disturbing when the room is too quiet and there's no sound around me. I can never focus. Maybe it's the legacy of Istanbul, because as I said, I lived in Istanbul long years, and I lived in a part that was much more noisier during the night than during the day. So I'm very used to the sounds of the city. As long as people are not talking directly to me, I love sound and I love music. And the kind of music that I listen to a lot is usually very loud, high energy genres of heavy metal music. Ever since my youth, I have been a big fan of heavy metal. And over the years, I moved towards more Scandinavian, Viking metal or metalcore, progressive metal, symphonic metal. So
what do you find in heavy metal?
I find a combination of contrast, especially melodic, even melodic death metal. I mean, which can be a very extreme form, but this dark and light. It's mostly dialectics of life, and I think people think if you listen to heavy metal music you'll become aggressive, but I think it's just the opposite. And I know many heavy metal musicians who are very gentle souls in their private lives. There are some crazy bands, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, because heavy metal is a huge kingdom, it's a huge country, and there are many bands that I respect a lot and I listen to a lot. So that surprises sometimes my readers, because people don't expect a middle-aged Turkish woman to listen to heavy metal, but I have always been a big heavy metal fan.
We don't only see you as a middle-aged Turkey woman. I read something about gloves as well. That you have many gloves with the fingertips cut off.
Yes, and I don't know why what's the psychology behind that, but fingerless gloves, I just love wearing them. Also hoods. If I can wear anything which is a hood, just pulling that up and wearing the gloves and listening to heavy metal, then I can transplant myself into a completely different world. Whether I'm writing a historical book or a different geographical location, you can zoom, in and out.
Mm-hmm. And when are you satisfied with a day's writing?
When am I satisfied? The novel tells you when it's done, when it's over. And it's a very long process. Of course, then you send it to your editor. Then there's an editorial work, which I also find important. I also enjoy working or learning from my translators. Now, my books are translated into over 50 languages now. And over the years, I learned a lot from that. Because you start thinking about words that cannot be translated easily from one language to another. And why is that? It says something about that culture or the other culture. So I pay a lot of attention, I think, to the craft behind the novel, as well as the story.
Was today a good day for writing? Did you work?
Today was a good day, yes. For last week, it wasn't a good time. As I said, you go through moments of doubt and anxiety, but that's all part of the process. And if anyone thinks that it gets easier, I don't think it gets any easier. Whether it's your first novel or your 10th novel, you always go through those tunnels of anxiety. And then there are days when you realize, wow, there's a story here.
A Dutch colleague, writer, compared writing novels with running a marathon. It never gets easy. You might get better in it, but it's not easy. Are you working now on a novel?
I am right now working on a novel, yes.
Could you tell something about it already?
I find it difficult to talk about work in progress, but hopefully when we meet next time, we will be talking about that book.
I hope we will see you in Rotterdam then. I want to close with some questions from the audience, if people are still with us.
There are still, there's more than 100 people still with us. And I would like to give the floor to Georgiana, who has joined us all the way from Romania, and she's asking for recommendations. Georgiana, please unmute your microphone.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question is about the books you wrote. Which one do you consider the most powerful and why?
You know, you asked me the one question that I am always afraid of, because it's very difficult for me to choose one book among the books that I have written. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, honestly, I think I was a different person before I started writing each and every book. And by the time you finish every book, something in you changes, something in me shifts. I learn from the writing process. So you're a different person by the time you finish the book. And in that regard, I find it almost impossible to choose one particular book. But if you press it and if you ask me to choose nonetheless one title, I will always say that the book I'm yet to write will be the book that that will be my favorite.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question or one last question?
Sure.
About women, I see some questions about violence against women.
Yes, I'll give the turn to Aruna, who's almost always with us. Aruna, please switch on your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Good evening. I have a question about femicide. It's on the rise these days, and it actually worries me a lot. And how can we tackle femicide in these modern times with all the digital advancements? But it still is in a lot of countries, also in very big democracies and developed countries, it's a huge problem, like in Mexico. So how can we tackle it with maybe international laws, or maybe you have a suggestion?
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing this up, because like you, I think it's so important, so critical, and it's on the rise. Not only, of course, femicide itself, but also domestic violence, all kinds of sexual violence should also be in this conversation. Sometimes it's more difficult to talk about them because they might not be part of statistics, but it's a huge problem we have in front of us. And it's becoming worse and worse. We also know that with the pandemic, many women have been locked up inside homes and inside situations where they experience domestic violence or sexual violence almost every day. So we have a growing problem, like in Mexico, like in Turkey. For instance, in Turkey, the rise in violence against women, cases of femicide, has been 1,400% in 10 years, 1,400% increase in cases of violence against women. So it is massive, and not enough is done. One thing that is very important is conventions like Istanbul Convention, which is the first international treaty that has been signed by 45 countries so far, but it has to be implemented. Signing is not enough. It has to be ratified, it has to be implemented. That, for instance, Istanbul Convention makes it very important that we open shelters for abused women and children. Also changes the laws, patriarchal laws. We need to help victims, provide them financial support, psychological support, legal support. All of that is very important. For all of that, we need to be organized as women. I think this is an important time for global solidarity, but also especially for global sisterhood. We know that women's rights are in danger at this moment, and unless we work together, I find it very difficult to solve these incredibly urgent issues that we have. And if I may also add this, for me, it's also a very emotional subject, because Turkey, Istanbul Convention, there's a reason why it's called Istanbul Convention. It was signed in Istanbul. Turkey was the first signatory to this treaty. And yet today, fast forward, the same government is trying to withdraw from the treaty, wants to drop it. Not only Turkey, but Hungary wants to drop it. Poland wants to drop it. So this is happening. Even the steps that were taken are now taken back from us. And that is why I think it's very important that we remain alert and aware of the rising statistics of femicide, and we increase women's activism, women's rights activism, and also human rights activism.
Do you see things change positively in Turkey as well?
In terms of women's rights and LGBTQ rights, changing positively? No, just the opposite. I think we've been going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could say that we have made progress, but that is not the case.
I meant activism. Is there...
Yes, I understand. You're right. You're right in the sense that it doesn't mean that the fact that a country is patriarchal or homophobic doesn't mean that women are weak, or it doesn't mean that women are silent or passive. And in Turkey, we have lots of women of all backgrounds who are quite vocal. And there is an important women's movement, but it's not enough. You know, we need to be better organized. We need to support each other. We need to empower each other. And also, I think we need to empower sexual minorities. So for me, this is very important. It always goes hand in hand, women's rights and human rights for everyone together.
Mm-hmm. Last question for me. During the pandemic, in prisons in Turkey, people were could leave the prison because of the coronavirus, but that wasn't the case for a lot of journalists and writers, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. And actually, political prisoners were kept inside prisons. So we have, so many names, like the leader of HDP, Demirtas, Selahattin Demirtas. We have writer Ahmet Altan. We have Osman Kavala, who is a very important philanthropist and civil rights activist. We have also Amnesty Turkey members who have been, brought to trial so many times. We have so many academics who have been put on trial or lost their jobs because they just signed a peace petition. I don't even know where to start, to be honest. So it is a massive problem in terms of this big crackdown on civil society and civil liberties. And unfortunately, there are many writers, journalists, and intellectuals and academics who have been very, very wrongly and unfairly and unjustly accused for doing nothing.
Is there hope for sanity for Turkey?
Of course there's hope. I mean, when you talk to people, to women, to students, to minorities, I think you will feel so much hope in your heart because they are there. There are many people in Turkey who believe in democracy. There are many people who are global souls. Maybe we don't hear their voices. Maybe they don't make it to the headlines, but they exist. The problem, I think, in countries like my motherland is because the governments are so conservative, nationalistic, authoritarian. The world thinks that the entire country is like that, but not at all. So I do make a distinction between the ruling elite and the people. And the people are oftentimes far ahead of the people who rule them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elif Shafak, for sharing your thoughts, for answering all the questions. We hope to meet you in Rotterdam for your next book, for your next novel. We'll be back in March or April. We don't have a list of writers, but we're working on it. And I want to thank all people at home for watching and being with us. Thank you.
I want to thank you, and also I want to thank everyone who listened to us. Thank you.
Thank you.